That night, I sat at table 14, looking at the stage like a visitor observing a life that didn't belong to me. The Westfield Grand Hotel displayed everything in a way that they believed successful people should be surrounded: chandeliers, white tablecloths, and the soft clinking of wine glasses. The room was noisy but not friendly. Bursts of laughter, whispers, the tapping of high heels on carpet. The faint scent of perfume drifted through the air, sometimes overpowering the food, sometimes making me inhale deeply just to stay calm. I felt like a shadow among dozens of faces. My name was handwritten elegantly on the place card, but I knew I was only a small guest at a significant event. Evan, my son, stood near the entrance in a dark tuxedo, wearing the familiar smile he always had when surrounded by colleagues. He chatted, shook hands, and laughed with people I had only ever seen in photos. I was proud of him, but inside there was an emptiness that pride alone couldn't fill. When the program reached the auction segment, the room settled down. Evan walked onto the stage with practiced confidence, each step precise. I listened as he introduced a few major auction items: a weekend getaway, a set of rare wines. Everything flowed smoothly. Then he said there would be one last special item. I didn't think it had anything to do with me until he picked up the microphone and said, half joking, half serious, "Tonight's special item is a lunch with my mother." Laughter rippled through the room, but it was the uneasy kind. I straightened up, feeling my whole body grow heavier. There were whispers, and several people turned to look at me as if trying to decide whether it was a joke. Evan continued, smiling as though he were telling a funny story. "She stays at home writing little stories. Maybe she'll name a chapter after you." A harmless remark to him, but it cut into me like something cold. I kept my face composed. I had heard comments like that many times, the sort of teasing that left me silent. No one raised a hand. The room fell into an unusual quiet. Not the kind that comes from focus, but the kind that comes from not knowing how to react without seeming impolite. A few people chuckled awkwardly, but it didn't lift the atmosphere. I focused on the glass in front of me, gripping it as if it were an anchor. Then, unexpectedly, a voice from the back of the room broke through the silence. "I'll bid $850,000. Everything stopped. The speaker rose slowly and walked forward. I saw him for the first time, a distinguished-looking man in a well-fitted black suit, his steps deliberate. The room fell silent in a way that only happens during truly significant moments. Evan stood frozen, his face gradually draining of color. I looked toward the stage, my heart suddenly racing. I couldn't understand what was happening, caught between embarrassment, confusion, and a strange flicker of anticipation. All eyes turned toward me, and I knew this night would not slip away easily. If you've watched this far and believe that life always has new chapters, even after long years have passed, join our community. It's where stories of resilience, family, and the quiet journey of finding oneself are told in the simplest voice. We believe it's never too late to begin, and every path deserves to be heard. Don't forget to subscribe so you can follow along with the upcoming stories. Now, let's return to that gala night. 5 years earlier, I had ended my 32 years as a receptionist at Maple Crest Insurance. On a Tuesday afternoon, the company break room was cleared just enough to host a small farewell gathering. A long table was set with a few plates of cookies, some paper cups, and a small cake. On the cake, they misspelt my name as Margaret instead of Margaret. I looked at the extra letter and simply smiled. It happened often enough that I no longer felt surprised. People stood around me and wished me a happy retirement. They said the familiar phrases everyone says on occasions like that. I nodded, thanked each of them, and tried to give the impression that I was fine. Inside, I felt hollow. When I checked my phone, I found only a short message from Evan. "Mom, I'm stuck in a meeting. Sorry. Congratulations." That was it. No period, no voice, no hug. I read it twice and slid the phone back into my pocket. That afternoon, I returned to my small apartment in the River Hill neighborhood. The building was quiet in an uncomfortable way. The hallway was narrow and footsteps echoed sharply. When I opened the door, the smell of old wood from the cabinet near the kitchen mixed with the scent of the tea I usually drank. I set my bag down, stood in the middle of the room, and felt as though I had stepped into a space far too big, even though it was barely over 400 square feet. No more phone ringing, no more lunch hour bells, no one calling my name, even if they called it wrong. When I was younger, I used to wonder what else I could do besides answering phones and scheduling appointments. But when I was with Darren, every dream I had was quickly stamped out. He always told me I wasn't smart enough for college and shouldn't think about anything too far-reaching. I believed him for too long enough to forget what it felt like to like something for myself. Years after we separated, his voice still lingered in my head like an old habit. That evening, as I sat at the small table by the window, I looked out at the shared courtyard. Dusk was falling. A few people walked their dogs, each absorbed in their own busy life. And I, in that moment, realized I no longer had anything to move toward. It was then that an old memory rose up, unexpectedly vivid. In high school, I enjoyed writing short stories. A teacher once told me I had a gift for storytelling, that I had my own voice. That compliment was the one thing I had kept for myself, but I had locked it away in a drawer of forgotten things. That night, I asked myself why I had abandoned that dream for so many years, and I sat there a long time, as if waiting for an answer from a version of myself I had left behind. Later that night, after sitting still for hours, unsure of where to begin, I opened the laptop I had bought a few months prior. When I purchased it, I told everyone I wanted it to stay in touch with friends. But deep down, I had another intention I hadn't admitted even to myself. When the screen lit up, I placed my hands on the keyboard and stared at the blank page waiting for me. The blank page made me both excited and terrified. I typed a few words, then deleted them. Typed another sentence, deleted it again. The first lines were clumsy. My words felt disjointed, as though I were relearning how to speak after years of letting others make decisions for me. But I kept going. I reminded myself that no one else was reading this. No one was laughing. No one was judging. I was just trying to write a few lines, then a few more. In the days that followed, I spent every afternoon writing. Some days I wrote a long passage. Some days only a single sentence. But I didn't quit. I wrote about a woman living in a retirement community, a woman who kept things others thought unimportant. I didn't know where the story was going, but I knew I wanted to create someone I had never seen in other books. 6 slow months passed. Every day I opened my laptop, even if only to reread what I had written. And then, one morning, I scrolled to the last page of the document. The number in the corner indicated more than 230 pages. I stared at it for a long time, unable to believe I had done it. I couldn't remember how each paragraph had come together. I only knew that each night I tried to give it at least a few minutes. My main character was named Lydia Rowan. She was 63, living in the Cedar Grove retirement community, a place where older people were often seen as having already lived through the critical part of their lives. But Lydia was different. She was observant, patient, and able to connect the small details that younger people often missed. In the story, she became involved in an unexpected incident that helped her rediscover parts of herself she thought were long gone. I created Lydia with a straightforward hope. Older women could absolutely be protagonists. They had stories, wisdom, and lives full of layers. I had never seen someone like that at the center of a mystery novel, so I wrote the book I wanted to read. With every page, I felt as if I were reclaiming a piece of myself I had abandoned years before. I spent a few weeks after finishing the manuscript learning how to submit it for publication. There were so many guides online, each one different, leaving me confused and feeling like someone stepping into a room full of unfamiliar doors. I learned to write a query letter, introducing myself, drafting it repeatedly until the words felt clear and concise. I compiled a list of nearly 20 agents and publishers that accept manuscripts from new writers, and then sent out individual emails. The waiting days passed long and quietly. Every morning I checked my inbox, hoping for a positive reply, but usually finding only brief thank you notes for my submission. One afternoon while washing dishes, I heard my phone ping. I thought it might be good news. After drying my hands and opening the message, I found a line identical to the others, not a fit for our current list. I leaned against the sink as disappointment spread through my chest. Another night, while drinking tea, I received yet another email, so short it didn't allow hope to form. I received around 10 such letters over the course of a few weeks. Each one, I told myself, was normal. But no matter how I reasoned, the feeling of rejection always made me fall silent for a while. I didn't tell many people what I was trying to do, but one evening Evan came over for dinner and I told him I'd been submitting my manuscript. He raised his eyes, looking more puzzled than concerned. "Are you really going to publish? I thought you were just writing for fun." I asked back, "You think I can't do it?" Evan smiled softly. "Not that. It's just, you know how competitive this field is. I just don't want you to be disappointed." His words sounded like reassurance, but they made my heart sink. I only nodded to avoid saying more. Then, one morning, among the familiar rejection emails, there was a different subject line. Request for full manuscript. I read the sender's name over and over. Harbor Lane Press, a small publisher I had added near the bottom of my list. They wanted to see the entire manuscript. I sat motionless for a long time before I could calm down enough to send the attachment. 2 weeks later, I received a publishing contract. A real contract accompanied by an offer of light edits and a proposed printing schedule. They also asked if I wanted to use a pen name. I chose J.R. Monroe, a name that felt both familiar and distant enough to keep my real life private. The book was printed in a small run and released quietly. I checked its sales page a few times without expecting much. Then one afternoon when I opened the page, I saw a new review. 5 stars. The headline read, "Finally, an older female character I can understand." The reviewer said she was 68, recently widowed, and Lydia made her feel stronger during lonely days. I read that review slowly, each sentence settling inside me. When I realized I was crying, I didn't hurry to wipe my face. I sat still, letting the tears fall, not from sadness, but because for the first time in many years, I felt that what I was doing truly mattered. After the first book launched, I allowed myself a few weeks' rest. But Lydia wouldn't let me rest long. She came like an uninvited friend. Each morning when I made tea or cleaned the kitchen, she appeared in my head with a new story. So I opened my laptop again and began writing the second book. This time it came easier. There was no trembling before the blank page. I knew Lydia better. How she thought. How she noticed things others overlooked. I let her age another year, made her sharper, and gave her deeper confrontations with the things age forces people to accept. Each afternoon when I finished a chapter, I felt relieved, as if I had done something right. When the second book was published, I began receiving more emails. Letters came from women I'd never met, from both coasts, from different ages. They said they saw themselves in Lydia, feeling eclipsed and treated as people who no longer had a significant role. Some wrote that they had read the second book 3 times to reclaim the feeling of being seen. I read every letter, not skipping a single one, and each letter gave me another reason to keep writing. One morning, while checking email, an unfamiliar name appeared, Patricia Dunham Agency. I opened the message and read the first line with my heart pounding. Patricia introduced herself as a literary agent representing many well-known crime and psychological authors. She said she had been following the sales of my first and second books and believed that stories centered on older women were becoming an underserved bright spot in the market. When we spoke on the phone, her voice was confident but not hurried. She said what I was doing wasn't merely writing stories, but opening a new space for readers who hadn't often seen themselves in books. "Margaret," she said, This series could go much further, and I want to work with you." I sat in my small living room feeling as if someone had handed me an opportunity I had never dared to imagine. Patricia sent a proposal, and within weeks she helped me sell the rights to the third book to North Peak Publishing, a company with wide distribution. They allocated a much larger marketing budget than I had ever imagined. My name, still the pen name J.R. Monroe, was printed in the release plan they sent. I read every line, still unable to wholly believe it was real. On the day the third book debuted, I walked through Sierra Gate Airport to pick up a friend's flight. Passing a bookstore, I stopped because I saw Lydia's cover placed on a middle shelf. The new print gleamed. The overhead lights made the cover colors look richer than usual. I stepped closer and touched the book as if afraid it might vanish. A woman standing nearby also looked on and said, "I've heard this is really good." I didn't tell her I'd written it. I only smiled gently and lingered there a few seconds longer. In that moment, I knew I had crossed into a new threshold of life, a threshold I had once thought I would never reach. Success came to me right when Evan entered the busiest phase of his career. He had just been assigned to manage an extensive client portfolio at the financial firm where he worked. Every time I saw him, Evan was on the phone or had just put it down, but still wore the tense expression of someone who hadn't left work behind. I could see he was trying hard, and I could also see something else. The more successful Evan became, the less we spoke as mother and son. Evan's girlfriend, Laura, often accompanied him on his visits. She was polite, always smiling softly and saying thank you, but when I mentioned my writing, her expression shifted. Not in annoyance, just distant. Once I handed Evan a proof of the second book, Laura looked at it and smiled, saying, "It's great you keep writing as a hobby. At this age, holding on to a small joy like that is lovely." The comment sounded light but left a resounding crack. I knew she meant no harm, but she treated what I did like a pastime, akin to gardening or knitting, nothing more. Evan didn't add anything. He just nodded and set the proof aside. I sat there, trying to steer the dinner conversation to other topics so the evening wouldn't become heavy. Gradually, the distance between Evan and me became more than a generational gap. It was in the things we no longer shared. I knew he was working to prove himself. He often mentioned his boss, Mr. Sloan, the person Evan wanted to impress to get a promotion. He discussed quarterly targets, the pressure to retain clients, and meetings that often stretched late into the evening. Sometimes I wanted to hug him and tell him he didn't have to carry so much, but each time I started, I saw him checking his watch or his messages. He was running too fast, and when people run too fast, they often forget those waiting for them. The day Evan announced his wedding, I was happy for him, but felt my heart tighten. They planned a small ceremony at the city hall with only close family. Evan said there wasn't time, and neither of them wanted a big fuss. I nodded, but inside I felt sidelined from an event that should have mattered to the whole family. On the wedding day, I arrived early. Evan wore a gray suit. Laura had a simple white dress. Everything was so quick that I barely had time to feel it. I sat on the left side, next to two former co-workers I had invited just to have someone beside me. Laura came over and greeted me with a light hug, calling me Miss Margaret as usual. During the ceremony, I only said a few words. Mostly, I observed. After the ceremony, everyone went to the restaurant for the reception. I sat at the far end of the table, quietly listening as Evan discussed work with Laura's parents. No one asked me about my new book. No one mentioned Lydia. No one asked if I was happy. In that moment, I realized I was looking at my son as if he had drifted out of reach long ago. I told myself perhaps that was natural when children grew up. But there was something else, something that made me feel I was losing my place in my own family. And though I didn't speak it aloud, I knew the fracture had begun there. Evan's company's fundraising gala was scheduled for early summer. One evening, he came to my house looking hurried as he always did when buried in reports and meetings. After a few small talk questions, he went straight to the point. "Mom, I need to ask you for a favor. This year's gala is bigger than usual. I'm in charge of everything and I'm really overwhelmed. Do you think you could help me? Just for 3 weeks." I understood immediately that this was not a casual request. It was a plea. I looked at my son's face and saw the fatigue and worry in the way he leaned on the kitchen counter. He wanted to impress his superiors, and this event was a significant opportunity. I was halfway through writing the 5th book. The deadline was tight. Patricia had just reminded me I needed to submit the manuscript on time so the publisher could schedule the release. But when I looked at Evan, I heard the familiar voice of a mother. My child needed me. I closed my laptop. "All right, Evan, I'll help." The days that followed spun like a wheel I couldn't get out of. Tasks piled up so densely that I had to write everything in a notebook so nothing would be missed. Table centerpieces, the menu for guests with gluten allergies, invitation templates, a seating chart for more than 200 guests with detailed requirements about who cannot sit next to whom, phone calls to 3 audio vendors, reconfirming the band's check-in time. I matched each item as if it were a full-time job, and indeed, it was. I worked from morning until night, often forgetting to eat lunch. Whenever I opened the document for the book I was writing, my mind swarmed with the Gala to-do list, and I couldn't concentrate. Fatigue accumulated day by day. Some nights I sat on the sofa with my phone still in hand, checking supplier emails, my eyes stinging from lack of sleep. One afternoon, Laura stopped by while I was putting up the seating chart for the 3rd time. She entered with her usual smile, glanced over the papers spread across the table, then said with a tone that was part compliment, part observation, "Lucky you're home. We're so busy. No one has time to deal with this many details." She said it so naturally, then grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and went into the living room, not noticing me standing there with the paper in my hand. It was just a sentence, light as air. But it made my position in their eyes painfully clear. Someone idle without a real job conveniently available to be called on at any time. Part of me had known that for a long time, but that day the feeling felt sharper. I sat down at the table, hearing the faint hum of the air conditioner in the small apartment. I thought of the unfinished book, of readers waiting for Lydia's return. At that moment, Evan's message tone rang. "Mom, I need to revise a detail on the timeline. I'll send you the new version." I sighed, opened my phone, and went back to work. Deep down, I knew I was trading something precious. But I also knew that, however old I was, a mother's heart would always choose to sacrifice first. On the night of the gala, I arrived nearly an hour earlier than planned. No one had asked me to, but after 3 weeks of juggling dozens of tasks, I didn't feel comfortable unless I checked every detail in person. The Westfield Grand's great hall glittered under the chandeliers. I walked along the rows of tables, lightly touching each pressed tablecloth, straightening glasses that had been set slightly askew, and checking the guest names printed on place cards. When the staff brought the flowers, I opened each box to inspect them, nodding when I saw everything match the chosen sample. I wanted to believe I had done well, at least this part. As the opening time neared, guests began to arrive. I went to table 14, the table farthest from the stage, but I did not complain. That was where the unimportant people sat at events, and I had grown used to such places. Evan passed by, busy greeting executives and partners. He saw me, gave a quick nod, as if acknowledging a building guard, then immediately turned to speak with Mr. Sloan, his senior. I sat down and placed my hand on my purse, out of habit to steady myself. The auction took place after dinner. The host read the items, and the hammer fell as the bids climbed. I could see Evan near the stage, his face relaxing as the evening ran smoothly. He wanted to prove himself, and tonight was a significant opportunity for him to do so. Then, unexpectedly, Evan stepped onto the stage and picked up the microphone with his usual confidence. I thought he would introduce the final donation item, but then his voice came through, "And here is the special item I prepared for tonight, a lunch with my mother." The room stirred slightly. I heard a few forced laughs pop up like small, misplaced sparks. Evan continued, teasingly, "My mother mostly stays home writing little stories. Maybe she'll put you in a chapter." I sat up straighter, my hands clenched inside my lap. That seemingly harmless remark cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I had spent mornings and afternoons and every ounce of energy creating those pages. They were not a joke. The host lifted the sign, "Who will open the bidding for this lunch?" No one spoke. The murmurs died down. A heavy silence fell over the hall. A few people glanced at me and then quickly looked away. I could feel the awkwardness, the discomfort, and above all, the sense that I did not belong there. Evan forced a smile, but that smile began to crack. In that moment, a memory surfaced. 3 weeks earlier, Patricia had mentioned on the phone that a film company was interested in adapting the Lydia series. She hadn't named the company, only warned that if they contacted us, we should be prepared. I'd thought it was mere small talk. I hadn't dared hope. Then a voice from the back of the room rang out so clearly it made heads turn. "I'll bid 800 and deed at $50,000. The space seemed to freeze for a few seconds. The man rose and straightened his black suit jacket. He walked forward with steady steps, as if he knew he was doing the right thing. I realized he was not an ordinary guest. Evan stood motionless, his face draining of color. The host stammered, "Sir, you are—" "Victor Hale," he said, "head of content at Brightline Studios." A loud murmur rippled like a wave. I heard someone exclaim, "Brightline? They produce big series." Victor stopped in the aisle and turned toward me, "And I want to explain why I'm bidding." He faced the audience. "You may not know, but the woman sitting at table 14 is J.R. Monroe, the author of the Lydia Rowan series we've been trying to contact for weeks." A hush fell, then erupted into chatter, surprise, and people checking their phones. A woman at a nearby table sprang up. "I've read all 3 books. Oh my, she's here?" Victor continued, "We want to purchase the adaptation rights to the entire series for a television series, and we need to meet Ms. Monroe immediately to negotiate." I sat motionless, not knowing where to place my hands, not knowing whom to look at. I only heard my heart pounding as if it wanted to burst from my chest. At the head table, Mr. Sloan, Evan's boss, turned to look at my son. Not an angry look, but deep disappointment. That gaze felt like a full stop to the image Evan had been trying so hard to maintain. Then everything moved quickly. A group of guests came to my table, asking for photos and asking for my signature. A middle-aged woman grasped my hand and said that Lydia had helped her through a difficult time after retirement. Evan stood on the stage, watching the scene with an expression I had never seen before. Stunned, then remorseful, then bewildered about what to do. I excused myself and stepped outside for a moment. As I passed through the hall's large doors, the cool evening air hit my face. For the first time in many years, I felt truly seen. Not as someone's mother, not as the woman standing behind a successful son, but as myself. Margaret Hale, the woman who wrote Lydia Rowan, the woman who had just stepped out of the shadows of her life. The next morning, I was still tired after the gala. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat down at my desk, but didn't open my laptop yet. Everything from the night before felt like a strong wind sweeping through my life, and I needed time to make sense of what had happened. I was about to take the first sip when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Evan. Not the Evan in his neat suits, but Evan in a wrinkled t-shirt, eyes red like someone who hadn't slept. I opened the door and stepped back so he could walk in. Evan stood in the middle of the living room, hands clasped as if he didn't know where to put them. He looked around my apartment, the place where he had grown up, but today he saw it differently. After a few seconds of silence, he spoke, his voice hoarse and smaller than usual. "Mom." Mr. Sloan called me into his office right after the gala ended. I said nothing and waited for him to continue. He told me I was thoughtless. He asked how someone could stand in front of more than 200 guests and turn his own mother into a joke like that. He said my behavior reflected the way I treated my family. Evan swallowed, the sound tight. It's the first time I've ever been criticized directly like that. I looked at my son's face. For the first time in years, I saw actual collapse behind his confident exterior. Evan moved to the kitchen counter and leaned on it as if he needed something to hold on to. "Mom, I know I've done a lot of things wrong, not just last night." He inhaled deeply. "I've taken you for granted all these years. I always assumed you wrote just for entertainment. I thought, because I was more successful, the things you did were small. But last night, when they said your name, when they applauded you, I realized I don't know anything about you." As I listened, something inside me loosened slowly and tightened slowly too. Evan continued, his voice trembling more. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry, Mom, for not respecting you, for not respecting your work, for not seeing you as a person with dreams. I just kept running after work, afraid of failing, afraid of not being good enough, afraid of not getting promoted. I let those fears make me forget you." I set my coffee cup down. "Evan, I love you. That doesn't change. But we can't keep going the way we have." He sat in the chair across from me, back slightly hunched like a student waiting for a grade. "From now on," I said slowly, "I won't sacrifice my career for anyone. Not even you. I have deadlines, meetings, people who believe in the story I'm writing. My writing is real work. It matters." Evan nodded immediately, as if afraid I might take it back. "I understand. I won't let you do my work for me anymore." I looked straight into his eyes, feeling, for the first time in years, completely steady, stating what I wanted. "If you truly want to make things right, start by reading my books. All of them. No skimming, no pretending." Evan looked at me for a few seconds, then lowered his head and let out a soft laugh mixed with tears. "I'll read everything, Mom, I promise. I'll start from the first book. I should have done that years ago." He stood and came to hug me. Not the rushed, awkward hugs from hurried visits. This was a quiet one, real and heavy with everything unsaid. "I love you, Mom," Evan whispered. "And I love you," I replied. As he walked out the door, I watched him, not to check if he was okay, but to acknowledge something. We had just laid the first stone of a new relationship, one where, for the first time, I stood with my own worth, not trailing behind my son. And when the door closed, I returned to my desk and opened my laptop. Chapter 12 was still there, waiting for me to continue. I sat in my usual place, the coffee still warm beside me. The soft morning light filtered through the window, making the room look calmer than usual. I opened the manuscript for the 5th book and scrolled down to chapter 12, the chapter I had abandoned for more than 3 weeks because all my time had been swallowed by Gala preparations. The last line sat quietly where I'd left it, as if waiting for me from a temporarily forgotten world. This time, when I placed my hands on the keyboard, the heaviness in my chest was gone. No more tension between writing and trying to please someone. I wrote as if a door had been opened, and Lydia returned with her familiar, clear voice. The words came more easily, lighter, truer. I didn't know how long I had written. Only when the sunlight changed color did I realize time had passed without warning. That rarely happened unless my mind was at peace. Today, everything was back in its proper place again. 3 days later, while making tea, my phone vibrated unexpectedly. A message from Evan. "Mom, in the first book, why does Lydia choose to stay at Cedar Grove instead of moving somewhere else? Is there a deeper reason?" I stared at the screen. That wasn't a polite question. It was a question from someone who was truly reading, thinking, and wanting to understand. I sat down and felt my lips lift on their own, the kind of smile that forms naturally when you realize something has changed. I replied, Yes, keep reading and you'll understand. A moment later, Evan texted back, I will. I want to understand you better than before. I set my phone on the table and sat quietly in my small apartment, feeling clearly that the change in my son didn't come from pressure or guilt. It came because, for the first time, he saw me as an independent person with my own value and my own world, not just the mother standing behind him. That afternoon, I continued writing Chapter 12 with a lightness I hadn't felt in years, not because everything was perfect, but because everything had finally begun to move in the right direction. When I finished that day's work, I paused and thought about everything that had passed. Those quiet years, the dreams I thought were gone, the careless words that made me shrink, and then the moment I stood up and saw myself more clearly than ever. And I understood something I hadn't dared to admit until now. Family is always important. But family love can only endure when there is mutual respect. Older people are not the final pages of a life story. They are often the wealthiest, most profound chapters. And forgiveness, if it comes from a clear, conscious heart, not from endurance, does not make us weak. It opens a door for others to change, to reconsider, to become better versions of themselves. I closed my laptop, breathing slowly and steadily. My life, which once seemed to be winding down, still had unwritten chapters, and this time, I am the one holding the pen for my own story.